the new way of greeting people all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for joining us again in our Knowing Africa seminar series, which for those of you who've come before, you'll know is a series that wants to play with the idea of Africa as knowable and as itself a knower and a producer of knowledge. That's what the seminar program really seeks to do, is show you the diversity and depth and excitement in African scholarship. So thank you for coming again. I want to acknowledge that although we are all meeting in cyberspace, we're nevertheless located in place, and in my case, on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And I think there are people all over present in the seminar in spaces to which we have not always been welcomed. And I hope that, that by making this acknowledgement, I invite us always to be considering the ways in which we are included and excluded from conversations. I'm delighted today to have Simidele Dosekun from the London School of Economics speaking about her newly published book, which I think is making already small waves and is going to make very big waves, called Fashioning Post-Feminism, Spectacular Femininity and Transnational Culture, a book that's right at the heart of a rising set of conversations about capitalism and particularly forms of consumption, about feminism and its complicated politics, about affect, about identity, and about the ways in which we are in an interconnected world. So I think we're going to have some really interesting discussions. Simidele Dosekun is an assistant professor in media and communication studies at the London School of Economics, and she's joining us from Brighton in Sussex, where she did her PhD, where she taught. She did her PhD at King's College with under the supervision of the amazing Rosalind Gill. So welcome, Simidele. As discussant today, we have a colleague whose office is only a few doors away from mine at Carleton University, but we've not yet physically been able to meet. Nadia Abu Zahra, welcome to this conversation. Thanks for agreeing to participate. Nadia is an associate professor in international development and global studies at the University of Ottawa, and currently the joint chair of women's studies at Carleton University. Her work addresses feminist pedagogies, justice, and space. And I'm delighted really to have this conversation and have you part of it. Simi will speak to the book. Nadia will pose some points of conversation, and then if you will raise your hand as participants under the participants list, I will watch out for your hands and try to take as many questions as possible. So without further ado, Simi, could you tell us about the key arguments of this great book?
Okay. Thank you very much. So of course I must start by giving thanks to Professor Hassim for inviting me, and the Institute of African Studies and the Institute of Women's and Gender Studies at Carleton. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to see such a large audience. Thank you also to Professor Abu Zahra for agreeing to be in conversation with me. And I look forward to the conversation as well as the questions from the audience. And thank you to Femi for the extraordinary organizing and coordinating. So as I said, it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about my work. So in my brief remarks today, I'll give a summary overview of the book and of what I think and hope are some of its key arguments and interventions. So the book, Fashioning Post-Feminism, Spectacular Femininity and Transnational Culture, it's a book about young, hyper-stylized, class-privileged women, Nigerian women in the city of Lagos, who dress in what I call a spectacularly feminine style. And this is a style which I'm sure will be familiar to many people in the audience. It's by no means a style that's unique to Lagos. So part of my interest in the style is precisely that I see it as a kind of globalized or transnational style of femininity, a style of feminine dress. So it's characterized by I describe it as characterized by the spectacular use and combination of normative elements of feminine dress. So for instance, weaves or wigs, false eyelashes, false nails, heavy makeup, the wearing of very high heels, and so on. So I mean, the elements of the style that I was looking at, they're less sort of about clothing, but more about the kind of feminine accoutrement that these particular women wear or were wearing. So the central question of the book is what kind of femininity is being performed in and through this style and in the context of Lagos. Otherwise put, the question that I was interested in and trying to answer is how does the woman, the stylized subject in the style of dress, who I call the spectacularly feminine Lagos woman, how does she see herself as what kind of self, gendered and otherwise constituted and positioned self? So to try to answer these questions, I conducted interviews in 2013 with 18 women in Lagos who self-identified as dressing in the style. And I should say, 18 very class privileged women, so they're by no means are they kind of representative of the Nigerian female sort of experience and self-stylization. So what I heard from these women in the interviews is that their style of dress is beautifying, and that by beautifying a woman, individually and all the more so in combination, the elements of the dress, so again, the makeup, the heels, the weaves, the false eyelashes, and so on, that they offer a lot of promise to women or to the woman in the style. So the promise of the style is that it will armor a woman, it will bolster a woman, it will prepare and support her to face the world and to take on the world, and all this by granting her self-confidence. So again, this is what I heard from my interview participants. So that the style, again, imparts self-confidence. It imparts what one participant referred to repeatedly as that oomph. So there's some sort of psychic and affective, but also physical kind of feeling of force. So the discursive logic and the discursive claim from the women, in short, was that beauty is power. Sorry, I have a dog. I don't know if you can hear him complaining about something. So yeah, the logic was that beauty is power, but in this case, again, very much a power that kind of works on and boosts the interior self. So again, I argue that spectacular femininity functions or promises to function as a form of psychic capital. But according to the women whom I interviewed, to successfully achieve and embody this style of dress is not an easy matter, and not just any woman can do it or can pull it off. And so therefore, in their view, not just any woman can access or benefit, again, the kind of the promises and the self-confidence and the sense of empowerment that the style affords. So why is that the case? So again, from what I heard from them, the style of dress is intricate, it's complex, it's expensive, and I argue that it's also physically and even psychically risky to embody. As such, it calls for a woman to do the style and to do it successfully, calls for considerable material resources. It's quite literally an expensive style of dress. It also calls for technical and bodily skills. So, you've got to have the sort of know-how. It calls for sheer labor and time. And I must say repeatedly in the interviews, I was quite taken aback by the amount of labor and time that the women reported spending on doing the style kind of day in, day out. And it also calls for mental vigilance and calculation. So let me give a quick example of the kind of risk and therefore the kind of vigilance that I heard the women speaking of. So the women spoke that, or they told me, or they explained that their frequent wearing of beauty technologies like weaves, false eyelashes and nails is risky because these particular technologies can cause damage to one's own hair, lashes and nails. So for instance, the idea that if you wear the weave too often or too much, that it can cause you to lose your own hair, particularly, I guess, your hairline. So this was the sort of physical risk that they talked about navigating and putting on the style and managing. And then I also argue, again, based on what they said, that they also were speaking of a certain kind of psychic risk of engaging too much with these beauty technologies. So here the risk was that one could become so habituated to the technologies, possibly even addicted to them, to the point of feeling at a loss or feeling not quite oneself, almost sort of misrecognizing oneself in the mirror when one did not have on the technologies. So there was a certain kind of risk of becoming self-alienated, or alienated from oneself. So for instance, one of the participants said to me that, you know, she had found that when she wasn't wearing false eyelashes, which she typically wore all the time, she said, and I quote, "I feel something is wrong with my face. I look at the mirror, I say, oh my God, what is wrong? Why am I looking so pale, so ugly, and I'm looking sick?" So she said, you know, finding and being concerned or alarmed that she was starting to, again, almost misrecognize herself without her false eyelashes, she had started to engage in a practice of what she called weaning herself off the lashes. But it wasn't a practice of disavowing or turning away from the lashes, but rather it was about sort of managing the extent to which one used them, not doing it too much so that you could keep kind of doing it. So again, so the women spoke of engaging in an on and off beauty practice. So allowing their hair and their nails and their lashes and so on to breathe. So they use that word a lot, to breathe and to rest. And so I conceptualize this as a kind of responsibilized practice of risk managing one's use of intensive beauty technologies, again, to avoid kind of addiction and physical damage and so on. And in the book, I conceptualize this as a practice of aesthetic vigilance. Still on the question of what it takes to pull off the style successfully, the participants distinguish themselves from other women who on the surface of things might look like them and could be mistaken for, you know, the same kind of type as them. So other women in the context of Lagos who appear in the same style of dress. And they did so in two main ways. Firstly, they positioned themselves, and they really insisted upon this in the interviews, they positioned themselves as women who are very much choosers. So, you know, the word, well, actually, I was going to say the word choice peppered the interviews, but that's not true, because I think the women hardly use the word choice, but they were often speaking about choice. So, you know, they position themselves as women who choose their style of dress for themselves, not for other people, not for external gazes or attention, and certainly not for men or heterosexual attention. So they very much position themselves as kind of as individualized subjects, as knowing subjects, as self-referential subjects, also as self-pleasing subjects. So again, this idea that I dress for myself, I do it to make myself happy, and I do it, you know, again, to kind of gain the self-confidence that my beautified appearance gives me. The second way the women distinguish themselves from other kinds of other similarly stylized women is by, you know, they echoed common stereotypes that that women who are highly invested in fashion and beauty are shallow and superficial and silly and so on. So they cited those kinds of stereotypes to precisely dissociate themselves from them, to say, again, I might look like women like that, other women like that, but in fact, I'm not that type. So you know, they very much sort of said and claimed that, you know, yes, I'm hyper, well, they didn't use the word, but yes, I'm kind of girly in my style of dress, but actually I'm very kind of substantive and serious as a subject and as a person, and I'm intelligent and I'm a professional and so on. So again, to give a quick example, one of the women said, she described herself as, so here I'm quoting her, she says, "I'm the most non-girly girl you'll ever meet." So then I sort of say, oh, what do you mean? And she says, like, I do my nails and I do my hair, but I don't talk about it. Like, I'm not, and then she puts on this, what I describe as a mock girly voice, so the sort of high-pitched kind of girly voice. She says, you know, I'm not the kind who says, oh my God, it's your nails. So she says, I'm not an airhead, even though I'm definitely into my looks. So again, very much kind of citing very well-established and common stereotypes about women's investment in fashion and beauty. And then she went on to say again that, you know, I'm not that type of woman, but the reality is that I'm engaged in the same kind of fashion and beauty practice as them. So I see them, I encounter them. So she said, for instance, you know, I might bump into women like that in the salon and, you know, have a little, again, I'm quoting here, I might bump into them in the salon and, you know, have a little chit chat. But she said, you know, she was more likely to associate with and be friends with, not those kinds of women, but their boyfriends. So she says, for example, I can have a beer and I can talk about politics. I wouldn't have a conversation about Kim Kardashian. So again, I'm not a shallow woman. I'm not a stereotypical kind of girly girl. So what we hear in these very brief examples that I've given to illustrate is that the women, my research participants, position themselves very much as doing a new and rare style of femininity they position themselves as an exception to the more typical or normal style of femininity and mode of femininity, especially in and for Nigeria. So pulling all this together, pulling together what I heard in the interviews, I argue in the book that for what spectacularly feminine style promises, and for being the kinds of women able to do the style, both materially but also dispositionally, that the women in my research see themselves as not merely empowered, again, empowered in and through the style, but also self-empowering and kind of recursively. So they're sort of in this kind of, not vicious circle, the opposite of, you know, a kind of happy, self-reinforcing circle of empowerment, right? So empowered to do the style and empowered by the style. And then I read all this, or I frame all this in terms of post-feminism. Hence, I argue that what they're fashioning is post-feminism. So post-feminism is a somewhat disputed and maybe somewhat misunderstood concept in feminist, not misunderstood, but that, you know, there are different understandings of it. So the particular way in which I understand it and use it in my book is to designate a popular, highly mediated and highly consumerist contemporary cultural formation and sensibility concerning the putative pastness and redundancy of feminism. So post-feminism, I argue, is a temporalizing sensibility that makes claims about the times, the gendered times that are present for women because of past or prior feminist gains and stages. It's encapsulated by celebratory rhetorics of girl power. So it declares women now empowered, able to have and do and be and choose it all, including, I think quite importantly, to return to normatively feminine pursuits. So post-feminism sort of promises, I argue, promises or declares to women that they can be girly again, and again, return to kind of stereotypically girly things without compromising, again, their kind of their empowerment or their can-do. I think we can understand it as a co-optation and certainly a commodification of the language and principles of liberal feminism. So, you know, telling women, or as I argue, selling to women that they, or let me say we, have equality and freedom, or enough at least to sort of, you know, make our own way and to resist sexism or whatever that may come our way on individual terms or on an individual basis. So of course, this is a cheery neoliberal fiction, as I characterize it in the book. And it's important to say, and I very much argue this, that it's not addressed or promised to all women. So at the time I began this research, so it began as my PhD dissertation. So I started this work in 2011. And at that point, the critical feminist literature on post-feminism as a cultural sensibility was written overwhelmingly, almost exclusively by white Anglo-American feminist scholars who saw and conceptualized post-feminism as specifically a Western cultural formation and sensibility, and one that had emerged in the West in response to second wave feminism. So hence, you know, the post is the kind of the, you know, post-second wave feminism. Likewise, in this literature that I was engaging with I started engaging with in 2011, the post-feminist subject was seen and figured as almost exclusively white, but also middle class, educated, upwardly mobile, heterosexual, able-bodied, conventionally attractive, and so on. So quite a delimited kind of type. And I think, you know, in the literature and certainly in my mind, I keep sort of referencing this. I realize I need to update this reference, but I sort of think of the exemplary post-feminist type as like the protagonists of the television show Sex and the City. And of course, that show was notable or, you know, notorious for featuring pretty much no women of color, or certainly not women of color of the same type as the four main characters. So essentially, when I began this project, women of color, or, you know, non-white women of color, let me say, were effectively missing or absent from the literature on post-feminism, not seen and not imagined within the terms of the literature. Again, this is about 10 years ago, so I think it has changed since. And while I was writing my PhD and later the book, you know, there is now a lot of scholarship on post-feminism that's not about white women in the global north. So as I said, women of color were mostly, in the North, were essentially missing from the literature. Women in and of the global South did appear to some extent in the literature, but quite crucially as constitutive outsiders. So there was a critical recognition in the literature, with which I broadly agree, that part of the logic and sense of post-feminism and of the claims that post-feminist culture made in the context of the global North was included that post-feminism could make a certain sort of sense in the North by displacing discursively and imaginatively the need for feminism, or what is probably more often thought of and referred to as women's empowerment. So displacing the continued need for women's empowerment precisely to the global south, to women in the global south. So the idea that, you know, girl power in the north, and what in the book I call girls to be empowered in the south. So, you know, again, gender equality or girl power as already achieved for some. Part of the logic of that is that, again, it's not us in the north that need feminism, it's those other women elsewhere, including, of course, in places like Africa. So where I'm going with all this is to say that when I began this project, within the terms and imaginaries of the existing literature, women like my research participants, particularly for being Black African women in Africa, for that matter, so not, you know, in the diaspora, women like that were essentially completely unseen, but also completely unimagined in terms of post-feminism within the literature. So the notion that they could also be being addressed by and also turning to the address of post-feminism was not imagined, and it wasn't possible within the terms of the dominant terms of the literature. So one of the key interventions of the book, again, I hope, is to offer a conceptual and methodological, but also empirically grounded argument against what I deem and call the Eurocentrism and blinding attention to whiteness of the literature, the early literature on post-feminism. You know, so I offer a critique of what I call its privileged inattention, essentially, to difference and to multiple forms and sites of difference. So I argue in the book that post-feminism is not the exclusive or inherent cultural property or possibility of white women in the global north. I argue rather that it's more productive, but also I think more apt empirically to think of post-feminism as transnational culture, as traveling across borders and, you know, borders of nation and region and culture, but also feminist historical borders. So I argue that while post-feminism may indeed have emerged or originated in the global north at a certain historical and cultural moment, so emerging in popular media culture from about the maybe early or mid 1990s, my argument is that it has since exceeded the north, and, you know, been put into transnational circulation by the many transnational circuits and connectivities that precisely constitute our historical present. More simply put, my argument is that post-feminism sells across borders to women who have, again, the requisite kind of capital, material capital, but also discursive and cultural and imaginary capital to buy into it. So again, precisely like women in my research. So for example, the very same media texts and representations that are read as vehicles for post-feminism in the North are of course also sold and consumed and have, you know, have audiences and fans and so on in the global South, for example. So here, example, we can think of Sex and the City and many other texts that travel. Kim Kardashian is another sort of, well, Kim Kardashian, the show Keeping Up with the Kardashians, but also Kim Kardashian, the figure, as a kind of traveling and transnational figure kind of propagating post-feminism. But also apart from the fact that in the global South we consume all kinds of cultural content from the North, additionally we also produce our own similar media and have our own similar representations and figurations. So here, for example, we could think of An African City, the web series An African City as an example, including because An African City, I believe, explicitly billed itself as the African Sex and the City for reasons that I don't actually understand why that billing. I mean, or, you know, why they would choose to kind of frame themselves in that way. So, so one of the key arguments or contributions of the book is to reconceptualize post-feminism as transnational culture. But in addition to this, in the book, I also argue for an understanding of the culture as performative. So I argue that post-feminism hails women to see and style themselves in its terms, you know, in its promissory and very seductive terms, to see and to render themselves as women who can indeed have it all, and so on. And here again, I very much emphasize, I want to make clear that, so there's no kind of ambiguity, that my argument is not that post-feminism is simply available to every woman anywhere. You know, I think there's very much a material basis to the doing of to the possibility of doing post-feminism and taking up its terms. So key to my contentions about its presence and performance in general, but also very much in the African context, is that it's actually, I think it's quite elitist. I think in the African context, it's hyper elitist. So again, my argument is not that any African woman can sort of take up these kind of discursive terms and technologies to try and imagine herself or render herself as having it all. So with this conceptual understanding of post-feminism, again, as transnational, but also as performative, what I then try to do in the book is to very much trace and unpack the ways in which, again, what I've argued is a transnational and traveling culture, the ways in which it takes root and materializes locally, and how it comes to make localized and also very deeply class sense. So some of the ways in which I do this in the book include by historicizing feminine fashion and self-fashioning in the African context. So I start the book with an argument that, contrary to those who might imagine Africans as people without fashion, and by fashion I mean just quite simply changing styles of dress and pursuit of new styles and new looks and so on as a practice of distinction, among other things. So I argue that, you know, contrary to those who say Africans have no fashion, or at least not properly or not authentically, that we just have costume and garb and traditional dress and so on, I argue that fashion is in fact part of our tradition and is constitutive of Africanness, that it enters into the very fabric of what it means to be African. And I think, and I argue that we know this both from the scholarship on dress in Africa, but also from everyday lived practice on the continent. You know, we can see it's ethnographically obvious that Africans have very long been engaged in deliberate and self-reflexive and desirous practices of new modes of self-stylization and new modes of dress, and that of course we've done so on a very uneven material and cultural terrain, of which of course colonialism is quite central. In the book I also argue that in Nigeria, so I also try to, again, to further kind of localize the style and you know, explore the local sense of the style in the Nigerian context. So I argue that in Nigeria, and more especially in Lagos, I don't know if they're, well, I know Femi is here, the Nigerians and Lagosians perhaps in the audience who might be able to attest to this. So I argue that, you know, in those contexts, there's very much there's a long-standing culture of dressing to impress, or to put it in more colloquial Nigerian terms, dressing to oppress, you know, to kind of let people know who you are, like you're somebody. I also argue that, and again, you know, very much drawing on existing literature, that Lagos is a city with long histories of fashion and fashionability, including fashion design. And again, that it's a city, and this goes for Nigeria more broadly, that has a culture of material and visual splendor and excess and spectacle and so on. So I argue that yes, the specifics of my research participants' dress and mode of self-making may be new, but the mere fact of it, the mere fact of young Nigerian women, particularly class-privileged Nigerian women, keeping up with new transnational fashions and taking them on, and assuming a kind of naturalized right to do so, that is not new, and nor is it remarkable in the context of Lagos. And I make the same argument for Africa more broadly. I also address race in the book. So I argue that the women are not merely fashioning post-feminism, but rather, more specifically, a Black post-feminism. And I think this is an important argument to the extent that it has been said, and I agree with this, that in African studies in general, except in reference to settler colonies on the continent, arguably we don't think about race enough, and we don't think about Blackness enough. You know, we kind of take it for granted. So where race becomes central in my book is in reference to the research participants' hairstyling. So the women all wore weaves or wigs almost exclusively, and they constructed and defended this as what I call Black girly choice. You know, so they very much sort of said, like, it's not political, you know, wearing a weave, it's not political, it's just fashion. As one woman said, it's not that deep. And, you know, they sort of took up those kinds of positions in reference to and as a defense of, or against those who would bring race politics into the matter. And here, quite importantly, part of the women's defense of the Blackness of their hairstyling and the fact that it's just Black fashion, Black girly fashion, was precisely to position themselves within an imagined global Black feminine community of stylized practice. So they very much sort of referenced other Black women elsewhere who also wear weaves, you know, to kind of make the argument that wearing a weave is a Black thing. But quite crucially, even as they made very happy and celebratory representations of their weaves and wigs, again, as just choice, as beautifying, as feminizing, and so on, their talk in my hearing, or to my hearing, and as I argue in the book, was very much tinged with melancholy and ambivalence about their feeling, which I argue is a deeply historicized and sedimented structure of feeling, that their own hair was not girly enough. Hence, it had to be kind of, hence to do Black girliness, one had to kind of, you know, have a weave or a wig. I should say this was in 2013. It's possible that they might feel differently now in terms of, natural hair and so on. But overall, I would say that there was this sort of dual tone to the interview. So on the one hand, the overt and manifest tone and affective charge of the interviews was happy and celebratory. So again, this idea of I'm just this self-pleasing, self-empowering woman. I do what I want. I do it for myself. I do it by myself. I don't think I've said that. They also claim that they paid for their style by themselves. But all this, I argue, was underpinned by hints and tinges of melancholy and ambivalence, and sometimes even anger. But there was very little space for the voicing of that, in my opinion, and as I argue. So there, again, this kind of melancholy and ambivalence, and again, anger about the fact that a woman had to do so much work and rely on so many external tools and technologies, or again, what I call psychic crutches, to simply feel good about herself and to simply kind of have a sense of self-confidence. So having conceptualized post-feminism in the book as performative, as inviting women to make post-feminism true, to materialize its claims and materialize its happy subject positions, I conclude the book by arguing basically that post-feminism is a lie, that it's a failed performative, and that the reason why is that the necessary intervening conditions for the performative to come true or to do what it says have not materialized, which in this case would be for women to be something like, or somewhere like post-patriarchy. So again, I argue that post-feminism is a lie and that it's bound to fail, that it's impossible to inhabit, at least as I heard it from my research participants. Not only is it impossible to inhabit, but to try to inhabit it is actually a painful experience and a disappointing and even bewildering experience, because again, it doesn't do what it says. And I argue that this becomes or has become renewed grounds for renewed feminisms, which arguably we can see in popular and public discourse around us, to the extent that, feminism is, well, as Sarah Benet-Weiser has argued, that feminism is popular again, certainly in the global north, and I think probably in the south as well. That again, that there's a kind of new visibility and audibility of feminism since around 2014. Well, I dated to 2014 when Beyonce famously declared herself a feminist at the MTV Music Awards, which I should say I was in the final stages of writing up my dissertation. So for very selfish personal reasons, I was quite upset that Beyonce had suddenly said that she was a feminist, having been thinking of her and describing her as a post-feminist in my book. But so again, that there already has been a certain cultural shift, which I argue, among other things, is because post-feminism, as I said, is a lie and it fails to materialize. But of course, the question is feminisms of what sort exactly? Okay, I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you, Simi. That was absolutely fascinating. For people who've come in late, welcome to this seminar on the Knowing Africa series, co-hosted today by the Pauline Jewett Institute for Women and Gender Studies. And I'm going to hand over to Nadia Abu Zahra, who is the joint chair in Women's Studies based in the Pauline Jewett Institute at the moment. So Nadia, over to you.
Thank you so much for that talk. I can already see questions from the audience, which is a very large audience, and so I won't take too long. I was asked to take about 10 minutes to allow for questions to come into the chat. And so I imagine that at the end of our discussion, Simi, for 10 minutes, there will be a long list, not only of questions, but already there's so much praise coming in for your work, for your book. I will plug it. It's fantastic. It's a great read. And so, it's an honor to be able to have read it and to talk with you about it. I'll start with talking about three things that I thought really jumped out of the book, which is that even though you very humbly state that times have changed, that the thing you were trying to prove so crucially has now been proven, and I think nevertheless, it doesn't take away from the fact that this book achieves that goal. And that goal was to draw attention to the privileged inattention to difference that was in the scholarship on post-feminism. And that was the goal, and it is thoroughly achieved, absolutely thoroughly achieved through ethnography, through very detailed, intimate, funny conversations with very high profile individuals. And that's the second thing that I will draw attention to. It's this great irony, for me anyway, that you use, and you have to use pseudonyms for the women because they're superstars. You've interviewed superstars of one of the world's most important countries. These are television personalities. These are Nollywood celebrities, bankers, highly positioned in the business community. For me, it's this great irony that you've spoken with the superstars and you can't tell anybody. It's a secret. So, and then the third thing is that unlike any book I've ever read, you are methodologically humble through the entire book. And you're always, if anyone wants a methods book for your teaching, this is a methods book, because you're constantly going through and doing what I'm just so shocked. You're saying, well, if I'd done this again, I would have done it differently. And I really shouldn't have said that, but I did. And this is how it came out. And I just thought, wow, for someone to come right out in your book and to say that I didn't think my methodology was perfect, but here it is, and these are the results, I just think is so wonderful, because we can all learn from that. We can all learn from your reflection, your way of saying, this is how it was done, these are the results, and this is how I would do it if I were to do it all over again. And I just think that really sets the book apart and puts it ahead and helps us all be more reflective and more honest and transparent and humble about our own work. So thank you for that. And I said there were only 3 things, but there's a 4th one too, which is how I, as someone who has never been to Nigeria, absolutely enjoyed reading the colloquial language. You translate, what does Naija mean? What does girly mean? And so it's actually 2 languages. It's not just the colloquial language of Lagos, but it's also the colloquial language of post-feminism. So, what does girly mean? Echo for show, CC echo, dress to oppress. They were, which you explained today in your talk. There are so many examples of that keep it interesting, that keep it really, really grounded for the person who's kind of getting a sneak peek into what I think is this very elite culture that we don't normally get to partake of. Well, I don't anyway. So I was thinking about the idea of post-feminism and how you pointed out as a lie. And post-feminism, my understanding of the definition in the book, which is beside me here, is that it's that sexism and racism are over for some women. It's done. We're past the need for feminism. It's a post-sexism, post-racism. Some people get to enjoy this, and you're pointing out, well, I don't think so. And there's this section where, as you said, there's a melancholy and an ambivalence and an anger. And there's the section, I just need to share this with everyone, is entitled "Powerful Wives and Yummy Mummies." Just that it's. And there was some quotes that I really wanted to read, but I was conscious that maybe people have children in the room, that, where they're just saying, like, I'm the powerful one in this relationship. The way I say things is the way things goes. I put my feet up and he can massage them. And yet at the same time, there's these allusions to that constant fear of losing that power, those instances where that power is not present, and the notion of post-feminism in very intimate settings and in very public settings is a lie. And I've talked for far longer than I thought I would, but there's still more in my notes. I wanted to come to how it connects with the savior complex. And what you call, and you quote others, these terms are from others, imperial post-feminism, and the title, missionary girl power. Right? Like, we don't need feminism in certain parts of the world. Sexism and racism are over, but those other people, they really do need, some of what we've got. And I just think we need a book on that. We now have a book on that. And that's really important. I just I don't want to make any specific references, given where I'm situated in the capital city of Canada at the moment. But let's just say that this notion of imperial post-feminism is really timely. So thank you for bringing that out. And I don't know if you saw some of the parallels with some of the discussions going on at present publicly, but I think that's really helpful. I will skip some of what I wanted to say and ask you a question, which is about, this is a book about post-feminism from a post-colonial scholar, but I want to ask you, and I have a whole bunch of quotes from the book, about whether you think post-colonialism, if it were to be interpreted as colonialism is over, the way we interpret post-feminism as feminism is over, is also a lie. So I'll quote very quickly that you use words like Western dominance in the world, the extractive economy, structural impoverishment, a rentier elite class, not so different from indirect rule, co-optation, tokenism, military coups over 3 decades, white supremacist structures and violences. I'm sorry if this is getting depressing. Systematic colonial degradation, delegitimization of indigenous cultures and knowledges, old insecurities, histories that cannot be wished away, privatized and securitized space, ready availability of feminized labor that they found cheap, controlled access to places like cafes, extreme rural poverty, worsening ecological degradation, ethno-religious tensions from British imperial design and global militarism. And can I just say that the irony of speaking all of this, again, from my position on unceded, stolen Algonquin territory is incredibly present. And so the question is, you'd said in your talk, colonialism is quite central. How do you feel about the word post-colonial in that context? And whether maybe it just doesn't mean colonialism is over.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Before I answer the question, I've just been scribbling frantically as you were speaking. Thank you for the comments. I must say I'm particularly chuffed that you said it's a methods book. I take that as a serious compliment. Thank you. As you said, the kind of acknowledging and hopefully the sort of showing of the messiness and the discomfort of qualitative and feminist research methods, including the discomfort of doing research with women on feminism with whom you essentially disagree very strongly, and the question of what are my kind of responsibilities towards them and how do I represent them fairly and so on. Also, sorry, before I get to the question, I know, sorry, how much time do we have? Is it until, it's an hour and a half, is it?
Well, we've got a half an hour left.
Okay.
And there are already a few questions in chat.
Yes.
Up to you how you want to take it, Simi.
Yes, okay. So let me I was going to give an anecdote from the field, but I won't just because of time. So in terms of the question about post-colonialism, I don't know if you were asking specifically about post-colonial theory. I suppose I don't understand or hear post-colonialism, either the reference to post-colonialism or post-colonial theory as saying that colonialism and colonial logics are over. That's not how I do sort of think of my work and myself as a post-colonial feminist scholar. I would sort of situate myself in that camp. But I don't think it's about saying it's over. It's precisely about seeing and interrogating how colonial logics continue to constitute the present, I think. But having said that, one thing I try to do in the book, and that I argue quite strongly against, and I feel quite strongly about this, even just from my own personal positionality, is that I'm very skeptical and critical of kind of African sort of nativist responses to colonialism and imperialism. So hence, for instance, as I said briefly in my talk, I make an argument about fashion, including fashions from elsewhere as part of African tradition. So I don't believe in or want to sort of have a kind of essentialist retreat from colonialism and imperialism. I don't think that's how Africans live or how we think of ourselves in practice. And I also think, and I say this in the book, I think there's a certain violence in expecting that Africans should be kind of authentic subjects in a post-colonial, given the fact of colonialism and the history of colonialism. You know, the idea that there's, first of all, I don't even think there is any authentic African subject, but even if there were, I don't think we can go back to, well, I don't think there is anyway. So, I mean, it's sort of a moot point. But so again, so actually I must say, when I was thinking about what to speak about today, I did initially start actually preparing remarks on this kind of line of direction. Saying that, you know, when I presented this research, as I said, it was my dissertation, so I've been working on it for quite a long, almost 10 years, and I presented it quite a lot. I typically have images of the kinds of stylized subjects that I'm talking about. And almost without fail, when I have images, I get responses from the audience, both Africans in the audience, but also, I suppose, mostly European and American scholars in the audience, saying, oh, that's not a real African woman, or these, why are you studying these women? These are not, again, they're not the real types, or they're not representative, or they're not authentic, you know, those kinds of things. So I very much try to sort of push back against that. So even as I'm critical of post-feminism, for me, the critique is not that Africans or African women should not, or do not have a right to be engaging in these kind of modes of self-stylization, that they're not sort of properly for us because we're African. My critique is rather coming just from a feminist position, you know, as to the kind of the violence of, or I think the violence, and again, the lie and the fiction of post-feminism. Yeah, so maybe I'll leave that.
Should we take some audience questions? Thank you, Simi. So Anne Svetkovich, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? There are a few questions here, but I'm just going to take them in the
I came forward to show my face of whatever gender I am today. I don't know that I'm first in the queue, but here I am at Carleton. Hi there. I'm Anne Svetkovich. I'm the director of the Pauline Jewett Institute of Women's and Gender Studies, which is one of the co-sponsors of today's event. And this was great. And my question was about whether and how you might have been informed by work on the kinds of femininities one finds in the performances of drag queens, of transgender women, and also of queer femme women who are often neglected even in lesbian context, but there's a long tradition of the performance of femme identities that are gender non-conforming, non-heteronormative. And it's a particularly live and lively tradition within Black and racialized contexts as well. Now, I may be thinking more in a sort of US or North American context. So again, I think there's wonderful opportunity in your work for comparative analysis of queer genders across a range of contexts. So I really appreciated the specificity of your field work, and just wondering, yeah, whether there's other possibilities for comparison along queer lines.
Can I take more than one question, Simi?
Okay.
Just, yeah?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, thanks. Abu Bakr, did you want to pose your question? It was up early, I know.
Well, hello, thank you for giving me the floor. I wrote it, I don't even remember every aspect of it, so let me see if I read it now. Thanks for your presentation. My question was, and I think part of it seems to have found the beginning of an answer. It's really whether you feel that, let's say, visual culture or moving image producing industries like Nollywood have engaged with this question that you are exploring in your book, and how have they done so? Do you feel that they reify, they complicate, or contradict some of the things, the theses you are putting forward in the book? Do you have specific examples? And is there a gendered nature also to the kind of representation precisely that may exist out there? In other words, does it depend on whether one is a male or a female filmmaker? for example.
Thanks, Abubakar. Natalia Garrido.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that wonderful presentation. I actually read your paper and I'm using it a lot for my own dissertation, and it's very good. And I just wanted to ask if did you find any, what about other dimensions of post-feminism, like economic activity, sexuality, ideas about motherhood? Like, are these women challenging these more normative ideas of femininity, or are they just like more gender conforming with this whole notion of femininity?
Yeah.
That's great. Can you take one more and then we'll turn it back to you? I have a long question from Catherine Burns. Catherine, do you want to ask this question? Catherine's still there? Okay, maybe she's not.
Yeah, but I can read the question. I mean, I've seen the question. So I can...
You've seen the questions. Great. Okay, Simi. So Catherine's question was about linking to the literature on the modern girl, which looks at an earlier period in African history and the sort of urban subject formation. Simi, do you want to respond?
Yes, okay, so let me quickly respond to Catherine's question. Yeah, so the collection, The Modern Girl Around the World, was very key for my thinking. So for those in the audience who may not be familiar with it, it's an edited collection that looks at the figure of what is maybe more commonly called the flapper in the 1920s and 30s as she emerged around the world, mostly in media texts and in commodity culture. So for me, it was that collection was very key, including methodologically, for thinking, again, precisely about the kind of the traveling of feminine styles, feminine fashion and beauty technologies, but also then discourses and ideas and imaginations of new kind of feminine subjectivities. So I did very much draw on that book, and part of the historicizing of African women's participation in transnational fashion and beauty culture was by way of reference to that collection. There's a chapter in the collection about women in Johannesburg in the 30s, participating in this flapper kind of style. Let me, if I may, then speak to the question about Nollywood Media. So in the book, I don't specifically look at Nollywood Media, or indeed I don't really look at much local media. I should say that when I began the project, I felt my initial sort of thought and feeling was that I had to, I initially planned to have a textual analysis as one part of the project, and then the interviews, because I felt that I had to sort of demonstrate through looking closely at Nigerian media texts that there was indeed a kind of local post-feminism being articulated in Nigerian media culture. But then I moved away from that because I realized I wasn't particularly interested in that. But also when I did the interviews, I mean, I'm glad I didn't do that in the end, because I then found in the interviews that, I mean, I don't make an argument about where precisely the women's ideas of self come from, because I don't think that argument can be made. Even if I had done that sort of mapping of Nigerian media, I don't think I could then say, oh, these women have these kinds of ideas of self and these kinds of repertoires because they see them in Nigerian media, because really my argument is precisely that they, in the words of one of them, that they're plugged in, that they consume media and they're exposed to different kind of cultural formations and sensibilities from multiple places and multiple directions at once, and that the source can't really be isolated. So I don't, in the book, I don't specifically look at Nollywood Media. Of course, the participants, I did ask them, one sort of sub-theme of the interviews was asking them what media they consume. And overwhelmingly, so one of the women was a Nollywood celebrity, and some of the others were also kind of media figures in Nigeria, but overwhelmingly they were very disdainful of Nollywood and of Nollywood celebrities, and said, they're just really not that stylish, they're not style inspirations for me, they're much more interested in Beyonce and Rihanna and Halle Berry and so on. So the local kind of media, and likewise Nigerian women's magazines, they just thought, no, they're not that good, they're not very sophisticated, they're a bit sort of tacky. So local media didn't feature heavily. But having said that, I will say, so it's not in this particular project, but I do think Nollywood, and particularly what is now being called New Nollywood, so the more kind of glossy, glamorous, elitist kind of Nollywood that we've seen emerging in the last few years. I do think if you look at that, at those texts that are emerging, they do, certainly in terms of just the sheer kind of fashion and style, I think they do very much engage with the kinds of ideas that the women in my research did. Likewise, I mean, I don't know, some people may be familiar with Moa Budu, for instance. So she's a Nigerian media figure, I suppose, or entrepreneur. She has a television station called, I think it's called Ebony Life TV or something. So again, if you look at those kinds of sites, it's very, the representations of femininity, of elite femininity, again, they're very sort of glamorized and fashionable. And there is very much this kind of can-do femininity. One thing I didn't say in my remarks today, and I think this maybe speaks to one of the questions, so not one of the questions that you cited, Shireen, but the question from, sorry, I won't try and find it, but basically, one thing I didn't say this afternoon is that, so the women very much spoke about, you know, being independent women. So they all, I think 3 of them were university students. All the rest were professional women or working women. You know, they all had careers of some sort or the other. And they very much sort of spoke about and positioned themselves as independent women in terms of economic independence and financial independence. And even those who were still kind of partially dependent on parents, like still living at home and so on, they certainly had aspirations to financial independence. But part of what I argue, and this is one of the ways in which I try to sort of, again, localize and historicize this particular kind of performance of self, is to say, again, that is not new in the Nigerian context, particularly in southern Nigeria. And particularly, I mean, the sample was ethnically diverse, but Lagos is a Yoruba city, you know, so I would say particularly in southern Nigeria, but also let me say in Yoruba culture, that women, there is a long history and tradition that predates Western feminism of women precisely pursuing economic independence and working for, you know, generating an income independently. So that is one of many ways. So actually, I think this speaks to, sorry, the question by, the last question. Sorry, I've forgotten who it was from.
They keep coming.
From Natalia. Yeah. The question about, you know, were these women challenging other ideas about normative femininity? So certainly the women said, you know, I'm not the type who's dependent on a man, and I do not aspire to be dependent on a man. And moreover, in the Nigerian context, and again, well, I mean, in the Nigerian context, but maybe in sub-Saharan Africa and urban Africa in particular, there are certain kind of ready logics and imaginations of the kind of the urban independent woman as being, in fact, a sexually transacting figure. You know, so that the young woman who you see in the city who has material stuff and enjoys a consumerist lifestyle, there's always this sort of ready suspicion that is she actually trading on her body? Does she have a sugar daddy? So again, the research participants were very keen to distance themselves from those kinds of positions and those kinds of readings, to say, again, I'm not that type. I do it myself. I pay for it myself. I'm not dependent on men. But again, that I argue that that is not new in the Nigerian context. You know, that is part of a certain kind of normative femininity in the Nigerian context, again, is that women, in southern Nigeria at least, is that women work. And then still on this question, were they challenging other ideas of normative femininity? I mean, not really. And I think maybe this can also connect to Anne's question, not really. You know, so I am often asked that question of, you know, do I have a queer reading, or could I have had a kind of queer, you know, a queering of this sort of subject position and of my analysis. And I suppose part of my answer is that as I saw the women and as they represented themselves, I think they were, you know, I don't think their performance of self, for instance, was ironic. It was very sort of serious. And in fact, there was one woman who said, you know, it was very serious. I take this very seriously. This is very much what I'm about. This style empowers me. I don't play around with it. I don't, you know, this particular woman was talking about an ex-boyfriend who had tried to say, you know, like, can you like tone down the makeup and the weaves? You know, like I actually prefer the more natural look or whatever. And she was like, no way, move away, get out of my life. If you don't like it, then, you know, you're not the man for me. Because again, I do it for myself and I find it very empowering. So there wasn't actually, as I heard it, there wasn't a kind of playfulness to it. It was a very kind of serious practice of self. Again, precisely because it seem to promise so much, or at least that is my argument. So I don't, overall, I don't argue that they were challenging normative ideas of femininity. And even in some instances where they did, I mean, so in terms of, there was one woman, for instance, who sort of said, you know, this idea of having it all, but in a way that was just not very kind of critically interrogated. So there was one woman who sort of had this view of like, I'm going to be independent, I'm going to be fabulous and so on, and I'm going to have a man who's also going to take care of me. And there wasn't a kind of critical reflection on the potential kind of tensions, perhaps, of I want to be a new, or I am a new kind of woman, particularly in the Nigerian context, but I also want quite normative things, actually. So there, again, there was just this kind of taking for granted that I can just kind of somehow magically just sort of make it work. Even if men are not quite as like progressive, let's say, as I am, you know, that I can just kind of pull it together. And on some level, that was part of what I argue is the kind of magical thinking of post-feminism. And the part of my critique of post-feminism, again, is that it leaves women, again, just without a critical kind of language about sexism, about patriarchy, and so on, because instead there's just this kind of happy, celebratory, again, you can do whatever you want, all you have to do is really sort of push yourself or really dig deep. But obviously, that doesn't work in a world that is patriarchal, essentially, and racist and imperialist and so on.
Sounds like that as sort of a question that I wanted to ask, even, you know, reading the book and listening to you, is that this is also labor, right? This self-fashioning. It requires incredible investments of time, energy, thoughtfulness, skill, all of these elements of what we would consider to be labor. Mm-hmm. And I even, you know, just reading your descriptions, which are so rich and evocative and so on, I felt exhausted by the work of being female, by the work of being feminine, even in these terms. Mm. And I wondered whether, I guess I wondered why that wasn't off-putting enough, like that to participate in this form of consumption, capitalism requires so much of already burdened people. Mm. Why is there not more pushback against it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I'll say, firstly, I felt exhausted too. And I should say that, I mean, I don't engage myself in anything remotely on this scale of beauty practice. And it was quite interesting. And I mean, just on Nadia's earlier point about, you know, this being a methods book, I don't know if I say this so much in the book, but I often felt quite inadequate, that I was inadequately performing my own femininity in the interviews, you know. Because the women, you know, there was one woman who said to me, like, oh, please go and fix your nails or something. You know, there was a certain kind of, they were sort of scrutinizing my physical appearance and finding it to be not up to scratch. So yeah, as you said, the work of, and also part of the work and the exhaustion of it, I think, is how much reiteration it needs. So it's the sort of the day in, day out, waking up and putting on one's face and doing all the layers and the contouring and so on. Going to the, you know, there was one woman who said she spends 6 to 8 hours in the hair salon every 2 weeks on average. So certainly, yeah, a lot of work and also a lot of expense. But as to why the kind of, I mean, I guess I can't really answer the question of why the investment in it. I mean, I think I argue in the book, so I draw on Lauren Berlant's concept of cruel optimism to argue, you know, so she sort of talks about cruel optimism, or she conceptualizes it as the kind of how a way to understand why it is that subjects become affixed to and reinvest their hopes in and keep returning to things that promise a lot but end up being cruel, right? So I mean, it's not really a satisfactory or complete answer, because there's a certain unknowability actually as to why in this case a woman would sort of keep returning to things that she finds painful or laborious, but also potentially physically damaging, and also, you know, as I said, mentally or psychologically damaging as well. But one thing I also sort of argue, and I heard this from the women, was again this, that a certain kind of sense of continuity of self gets built up and invested again in this sort of practice of self-stylization. So almost the thing of who would I be if I'm no longer kind of styling myself in this kind of way. And then the other thing, so I said earlier that the women very much spoke about choice. So this idea that I do it for myself, it's just for me, it's not for other people. And I say it in the book, almost without fail. Every single interview began like that. Oh, it's just me, it's just my style. I don't know, I just like it. 10 minutes in, they're saying, oh yeah, that time when I didn't do my nails, my friend was texting me, telling me to do my nails. So I mean, so again, that for me is one of the contradictions, or the kind of the falsity of post-feminism, telling women that you can make your own way, but actually that's not the case, because there's still so much sexist surveillance and disciplining and so on, to which women are subject. But
and participants, right? So not only that women are subjects of it, but that so often in patriarchy we see that surveillance being conducted by women themselves upon each other.
Yes, and the participants spoke of that. And again, one of the points of contradiction was, the moments of saying, oh God, it's so exhausting, oh, my friends say this thing to me, and then in the next breath they're saying, when I go to work, I pull my colleague aside and say, oh, you didn't do your hair, come, let me do your hair for you. So there was, the women, some of the women, a couple of them in particular, really kind of took up that position as I discipline, but again, I help and I empower other women. And I mean, if I may just say on this note, to speak to Nadia's earlier point about, missionary girl power and imperial post-feminism and so on, part of what I argue is that if post-feminism in the West or in the North makes sense by a certain kind of displacement to elsewhere, my argument is that, but that happens in the global South too, or in the so-called developing world too, not least because there are massive class and other differentials between women there. So my research part, it wasn't really said explicitly, but there was, again, this sense of, I don't need empowerment, it's that other woman over there who needs empowerment, which in some cases was, women at the grassroots level, but it was also, and probably actually in their talk, it was more so like my friends, so that or my female colleagues, because I'm this empowered, knowing woman, I know how to self-empower through this style. I go around imparting that knowledge and the tools, including sometimes literally gifting other women with the tools and technologies of this style of femininity so that they can empower themselves, which, to make that claim is obviously to position oneself as already empowered, and again, already knowing how to empower oneself, hence, bestowing that on other women.
There are a couple of questions that I can summarize as being about your fieldwork, Simi. Asking, was it difficult to do this work in Lagos? How did you address local cultures? How did you navigate various power structures? Perhaps we could close with just a comment on your methods.
Yes, okay. Thank you. So one thing I should have said is that again, despite my lack of spectacularity, I'm a Lagos girl myself. So, I was, very much kind of doing research at home. So in terms of access and culture and so on, some of those things were not so much challenges because I kind of knew the terrain. As Nadia said, I interviewed, I don't know if I'd say that women are superstars. I mean, certainly there were some celebrities among them, and some of them are well known, and so much so that when I talk about the project to people, like to friends of mine, there's one woman who I did interview who everyone always says, oh my God, did you interview her? Somebody said to me, oh, she's a poster girl for the style. And I sort of, like, obviously I can't kind of disclose who I interviewed, but, I did indeed interview this woman who's very well known as a Nigerian kind of media figure. So yeah, I very much kind of drew on social contacts and networks that I have to access the women. I have an article, I don't talk about this so much in the book, but I have an article in Qualitative Inquiry that kind of talks about the methodology, and it's a kind of reflexive account of the methodology, and in particular, an account of the processes of recruiting the research participants. So essentially, I had various methods I tried various methods to recruit them, but ultimately, when the first few methods that I tried were not working so well, I essentially started going around the city to the kind of, quite elite kind of social spaces where I was looking for a kind of class privileged figure. So going to, some of the like upmarket or the most like exclusive shopping malls and so on in Lagos. And physically approaching women as I saw them, which I initially found very difficult, but I found when I did it, when I kind of worked up the courage to start doing it, that it was actually very successful in the sense that people were interested and agreed to participate, and I ended up recruiting most of my participants that way. But one thing there, and I mean, again, speaking to sort of some of the questions in feminist methodology about power relations and so on, again, I think I've already alluded to this, but it's that I often felt very inadequate myself. And I felt that I was being scrutinized by the women. And indeed, I think I was being scrutinized by the women. You know, so I would approach women, I'd say, I'm doing this project, a PhD student, da, da, da. They would start asking me questions about, you know, who I was, what's up with my hair. I had dreadlocks at the time, you know, so I've lost my train of thought, but basically
you felt scrutinized yourself.
Yeah, well, the dynamic.
As much as you were being the scrutinizer.
Yeah, the dynamic, I guess I'm just going to say that the dynamics in the field were complicated, or, you know, more complex than that sometimes. I mean, obviously I was studying elite women, so already there's a kind of power dynamic there. Mm-hmm. But again, in the context of Lagos, I was studying women, I suppose, within my own kind of social, there were women to whom I had access.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can Nare has, if I may just respond to this question.
Yes, please do.
It's a practical question about how to access the book from Nare, who I imagine
to know about an affordable version for the African market.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, yeah, there's an electronic copy of the book. Unfortunately, there isn't an African or Nigerian distributor or publisher, but the book there's an ebook, and it costs about $20 US dollars. So hopefully that's somewhat more accessible to the Nigerian and African market.
Well, thank you. I think we should close on this great discussion. I once again thank Nadia, and especially thank you, Simi, for this great contribution to our debates and for writing such a highly readable and I have to say entertaining in parts, and kind of that moment of recognition part of it and so on. So thank you so much, and good luck with the book, and I hope it gets reviewed everywhere and read by everyone. And I wish you very, very well. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for coming. Within a week or so, except I don't want to commit Femi, who's already overly busy and burdened by the demands that I'm keep adding to his life. We will try and get this very likely edited version of this talk up on the Institute of African Studies website for people who want to use it. I feel like in these days of Zoom and online learning, you know, we have ways to use these seminars as well as teaching resources. So we would like to make it as widely available as possible. So thank you very much. Go well, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience.